1984 by George Orwell is a dystopian novel that follows the main character, Winston, and his internal struggles with the overruling government. Winston, a member of the Outer Party, wishes for nothing more but the downfall of Big Brother. Winston ends up making an effort to make his wishes come true by joining the Brotherhood, which is what he thought was a secret organization of people that wished for the downfall of Big Brother. His efforts end up all going to waste as he gets captured and arrested for thought crime by the man who had recruited him for the Brotherhood. Within the book, a thought criminal can be defined as someone who thinks for themselves, or as someone whose thoughts do not line up with those of the government. A member of the thought police is basically someone who tries to capture said thought criminals. Alright, so before I delve into how to identify a thought criminal and a member of the thought police, I'm just going to show and kind of explain pictures of the characters that I'll be using to portray the ones from 1984 that I mentioned. So for Winston, I'll be using this guy named Joseph Joestar from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and for Julia, I'll be using this old drawing that I did because I honestly had no idea what else to use. For Mr. Parsons, I'll be using Peter Griffin from Family Guy, because who else would be better to represent him? For Miss Parsons, I'll be using this lady named Inyaba from JoJo's because she's kind of wrinkly, and Miss Parsons is. For the Parsons kids, I'll be using just a stock photo of kids because why not? And for Syme, I'll be using Mr. Smithers' assistant from The Simpsons. And finally, for O'Brien, I will be using Stan from American Dad.
Also, Abraham Simpson will act as Mr. Charrington.
Step number 1. Look for a nervous tic or something off. One of the key steps to identifying a thought criminal is to look for a nervous tic. Some characters that could be noted of having a nervous tic or nervous tics are Mr. Parsons, Miss Parsons, and Syme. Mr. Parsons. When Winston had gone to the Parsons house to help fix a sink, it is mentioned that there is a very strong scent of sweat from Mr. Parsons. Now, I know that some people sweat more than others, but this man must be sweating gallons to make the house smell like it. The fact that this man is sweating all of the time sort of makes him a possible suspect for thought crime. This ain't the only time that Mr. Parsons is associated with sweat. As Winston is talking to him at the canteen, he also gives off an smell of sweat. Another wacky thing that Mr. Parsons does that marks him as a possible thought criminal is that he talks about how proud he is of his little spies, a lot. Again, it's normal to be proud of your kids, but the fact that he talks about them all the time could indicate that, deep down, he's actually terrified of his little rascals. Miss Parsons. Although Miss Parsons isn't really mentioned all that much throughout the book, in the beginning, Winston goes over to the Parsons apartment in order to help fix their sink. As he is there, the Parsons children act like spies and even jokingly accuse Winston of being a thought criminal. As they do this, Miss Parsons' eyes flitter nervously. Yes, she could just be nervous about her children possibly harming Winston, their guest, but there's also the possibility of her being scared of her kids, like Mr. Parsons. On top of that, as Winston is helping out Miss Parsons, he also overhears her kids complaining about how they want to go see the hanging that was happening that night, but their mom wouldn't let them. This could be seen as a small act of rebellion, which totally marks her as a possible thought criminal. Syme. Syme is a man who sits with Winston during lunch, and really likes to talk about words. As he talks to Winston, it becomes clear that his nervous tic is that he talks really quickly and a lot. Winston asks him about how the creation of the 11th edition of the Newspeak Dictionary is going, and Syme, in response, goes on a tangent about how beautiful the destruction of words is, talking about how the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow down the range of thought in order to make thought crime literally impossible. The way that Syme talks about language so often, and with such intensity, could sort of mark him as a thought criminal, as he just knows so much. Step 2. Determine if they are likely to get vaporized. The Parsons. Well, obviously both of the Parsons are at high risk of vaporization. They both live with 2 children who aspire to be nothing other than spies, so one minor slip-up means that it's all over for them. Although we don't know what fate Miss Parsons is faced with, we, the readers, do know what ended up inevitably happening to Mr. Parsons. After Winston is arrested and detained for committing thought crime, he ends up seeing Mr. Parsons in the same holding cell that he was in. Mr. Parsons ends up telling him that the kids that he was so proud of turned him in, as they had overheard him saying, "Down with Big Brother," in his sleep. Syme. As they are speaking, Winston determines that Syme will inevitably get vaporized, as he just knows way too much. Later on, Syme ends up going missing, being erased from existence as a whole. Exactly how Winston had predicted. Step 2.5. Take note of whether they ask for a razor or not, and if they have any. At lunch, as Winston is chilling with his comrades, Syme and Mr. Parsons, they both, at separate times, ask him if he has any spare razors, as there happens to be a shortage of them. Now, normally this wouldn't really seem all that abnormal, but the fact that both of these men, who later on are proven to be thought criminals, ask for a razor of some sort, indicates that they may want to end themselves before the thought police have the chance to arrest them. Syme and Mr. Parsons, people who are thought criminals, do not have any razors. Yet O'Brien, a member of the thought police, does. As Winston is joining the Brotherhood, O'Brien tells him that if he is arrested by the thought police, there's a possibility that a razor will be brought to him. This suggests that O'Brien, a member of the thought police, has access to razors, while thought criminals, such as Syme and Mr. Parsons, do not. Step 1. Ask them if they know the church rhyme. Within the book, only the characters that somehow betray Winston know bits of an old rhyme about churches that were in London before Big Brother took over. The characters that know bits of the rhyme are Mr. Charrington, Julia, and O'Brien. Mr. Charrington. The church rhyme is first seen as Winston is shopping in Mr. Charrington's shop. Mr. Charrington tells him a bit of the rhyme, which intrigues Winston and makes him want to learn more of it. Julia. Later on, as Winston and Julia are hanging out in the room above Mr. Charrington's shop, Julia notices that a building in an antique photo looks familiar. Winston recognizes it as a photo of the old church of St. Clements, and then recites the rhyme that Mr. Charrington had taught him. Julia then remembers another line of the rhyme and tells Winston. O'Brien. Eventually, as Julia and Winston are talking to O'Brien about joining what they think is the Brotherhood, O'Brien completes the rhyme, as he happens to know how the entire thing goes. The fact that people who betray Winston know bits of the rhyme is no mere coincidence. Although Julia is never confirmed as a member of the thought police, both Mr. Charrington and O'Brien, the people who know the beginning and end of the rhyme, are. Step 2. See if they have a telescreen and if they can disable it. In the case of Julia, she likely has a telescreen without the ability to disable it, as she is a member of the outer party like Winston. On the other hand, O'Brien is able to turn his off when Winston and Julia enter his house. Both Winston and Julia are completely astonished because, as members of the outer party, they do not have the privilege of turning theirs off. The ability to turn off the telescreen sort of marks O'Brien as a possible member of the thought police, as the fact that he is able to turn it off makes Julia and Winston more prone to letting out their real thoughts, and therefore giving O'Brien more the reason to arrest them. Mr. Charrington. As Winston is first looking around in Mr. Charrington's shop, he notices that, within the room that he and Julia end up renting later on, there is no telescreen. Mr. Charrington tells Winston that they're too expensive and that he does not really need one, and Winston ends up believing him. As Winston and Julia are relaxing within the room, they end up getting caught, and, to Winston's surprise, there was a telescreen present. The fact that Mr. Charrington had been open about not having a telescreen marks him as a possible member of the thought police, as Winston had wanted to rent the room due to the fact that there was not one present. To sum it up, so basically, in order to identify a thought criminal, look for a nervous tic or something off, determine if they're likely to be vaporized, and take note of whether they ask for a razor or not. On the other hand, in order to identify a member of the thought police, ask them if they know the St. Clements poem, and see if they have a telescreen, or the ability to disable it.
Thankful watching, happy and good day.